Hi, Facebook friends. Welcome to our edition of Cyber Advisor Live. This week we're going to talk about Macs, and Apple computers.
Apple computers.
Apple computers. All right. So what are we going to talk about, James?
I got a joke for you first.
You got a joke? I like jokes. Is this a good joke?
Yeah.
Okay.
But real quick before we get into the jokes, did you? I guess the Apple store over at International Plaza got robbed last night.
Did it really?
Yeah, it was in the news.
Wow.
They're looking for an eyewitness.
Eyewitness. Oh, that was great.
I know it's kind of corny, but
Yeah, that was good, though.
we had another one earlier we were talking about, but I told Todd he already laughed at it, so we couldn't do the same joke again.
I like it, though. You
it's
should
all right.
do it.
Now we're good.
Knock, knock.
So what do we, or actually you, what do you know about Macs?
We have one here at the company.
We do. This is it. This is our Mac.
That's our Mac.
We actually use this for, there's some valuable tools that we actually use this for. We use it for Wi-Fi analysis. And it also helps us do some MDM testing and sandboxing and things like that for Apple software releases and things of that
We do.
nature for
We
clients.
use it out in the field a lot.
Yeah. So, one of the topics that we want to talk about in relation to Macs today, though, and as it is right now, and I kind of pulled some numbers before we came into this conversation, was that Macs really, if you look at like the last 2 or 3 years, it's not like they're growing crazy. I mean, they're not all over the place, but they do account for 10% of the PCs in use in the world right now. And that 10% is really niche. Graphic artists,
Sure.
video production, a lot of audio stuff too, people that use like MIDI interfaces with them and things of that nature.
Sure.
It really is a creative tool. Beyond that, for some people, like maybe you're going to school, college, higher education, even some of the post-secondary type of stuff. There's a lot of education type programs for Macs, and I think that what we're starting to see is, they kind of like with the iPad, they put iPads in schools, and then kids start to adopt iPads.
Mm-hmm.
They get more used to Apple products. Eventually, a Mac comes into the mix.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, we have a couple clients that have a lot of Apple products.
Right.
We have one very large customer that has thousands
Right.
of iPads, but then we have some other customers, office, small business customers that actually use and prefer Macs over PCs, right?
Well, you think about but you think about like that, right? If they're putting iPads out in the schools, and they can teach kids at a young age to enjoy using an Apple product, which I think it's a great thing that they have access to technology. The brand becomes synonymous. It's like going back in the 80s, right? In the 80s, they were putting IBMs in all the schools, and the late 80s, early 90s,
Sure.
teaching kids how to do typing on those. So we, that generation grew up in a PC world. Macs were still there, but they weren't as prevalent because the kids coming out of school said, "Hey, I used a PC before. I know how to do this."
Right.
And that's kind of the same way they're going now with the iPads. It's the same concept. You're going to have another generation that's going to jump out with Macs.
It's funny you brought that up. When I went and attended college a while ago, all of the computers in our college at UT were Macs.
They had computers then?
Yeah.
I'm just
Really?
kidding.
That was the second joke? Yeah, they did. So, the first time I ever used a PC, like a real, what we consider a PC now, was when I did my internship.
Right.
But before that, it was all Macs.
Yeah, and I think so. When we look at Macs, a lot of what we hear about Macs in the marketplace is, oh, it's a Mac. It can't. There's no vulnerability on it.
Absolutely not.
There's not an issue with IT security on a Mac because they have elevated privileges.
Sure.
And you have to have super user credentials to be able to elevate. So there's all these different things. There's XProtect and Gatekeeper and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, I think if you really think about it, it's only 10% of the market share. So it's just that hasn't truly been attacked. There hasn't been a true reason for a business case to attack that as a sector, and we're starting to see that happen a lot more as you have common hardware, things like Intel chips, and vulnerabilities with Intel chips. So,
but it's not really true that Macs are totally secure.
No, it's not, and that's what. Yeah, and I think that's I went going back. Let's say it's just like 2 months. If you go back 2 months. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a vulnerability in Firefox that was able to target Macs. It was a 0-day vulnerability.
Correct.
About 2 weeks ago, there was another vulnerability that was identified in relation to hackers being able to invisibly bypass security prompts on the Macs. If you go back to May, there was a vulnerability that was identified in Intel processors for zombie load, and if you didn't have your Mac OS updated and patched up to at least 10.14.5, you weren't going to be covered. So, that there was still that vulnerability that existed. So, the real concern is the Mac itself doesn't identify zero-day threats. It's not going to say, this new security vulnerability exists, how are we going to approach it? And that's where it comes into solutioning that out, right, on the data tech side. Looking at a product like Sophos and saying, okay, well, let's put Sophos on a Mac. When we talked about the Firefox vulnerability, independent reports, Sophos was one of like 15 AV or next generation anti-malware, anti-ransomware products out there that actually identified it within 24 hours.
Right.
Your Mac wasn't going to do that for you.
No.
And so to depend fully on the Mac as your full security posture, just to say, okay, well, I bought this and I paid a lot of money for it, and it's a really good quality product, and I know I'm going to be secure because I paid a lot of money for it, kind of does yourself a disservice.
Well, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And I think that the other part from a business side is, what are we really trying to do? Like when we give somebody a computer, what are we really trying to do? We need to make sure that computer's secure. We need to make sure they're not using it for things outside of work purposes. We need to make sure that we have identity and access control, usernames and passwords on it, and how are we enforcing that? There's no way to manage that unless you actually look at a Windows server environment combined with some mobile device management for policies and things of that nature. And that's really a decision you have to make as a business owner.
Right. Well, let's touch on that a little bit. You have an iPad.
Yeah.
I have an iPad.
Yeah.
A lot of us here have iPads because that's what we use when we're out in the field.
Right.
It's a lot easier to flip open your leather cover on your iPad and start doing work or checking emails.
Right.
And all of our Microsoft 365 apps we have on our iPads.
Right.
And I think that's a common denominator with a lot of businesses.
Right.
Because it is a little more functional to do that than to go ahead and pull out your big laptop, open your laptop.
Well, that's what I'd say is that's also part of the joy of looking at this kind of hybrid environment, right? If I have users in my company that have Macs, and they have, let's say, iPads or Android tablets, and then they have a PC, and they've got all these different devices, and you're talking about Office 365, that's multi-platform. Right. So I could have my Mac version of Office 365 installed on my Mac. I can have my PC version installed on the PC. I can have the iPad apps installed on the iPad. Right. That ability all exists within Office 365. How you choose as a company to hybridize your environment, let's say, to say, okay, well, I'm going to put, this many Macs in my marketing department. Right. That really comes down to a business decision. But, once you put those Macs in, how are we or you as a business owner going to control those? It's great. It's just like the iPads. It's great to give them to a bunch of people, but if all they're doing on those is everything that's not work related, then you have absolutely no control out over your inventory. Right. Same way with the Macs. I mean, if you have no control over what programs are installed on those, you have no control over how often they change their password. You have no control over whether or not that computer itself is tied to certain internet security policies. Can they access certain websites or other websites that they should or shouldn't in your company? That all comes back to standardization. Having a Windows Server environment, at least to handle the password controls. Right. Mobile device management. We use Sophos for that. That works really well with a Mac product. It also works with Windows and Android and iOS and everything else. But specifically with a Mac, to get that level of control that you need, that's what you have to do. That's the route you have to go.
I think that's kind of why we're doing this episode, though, is to kind of tell people that there's still a need. Right. Whether it's with us or some other company, to have some kind of managed services, even if you're using an Apple product.
I mean, you think Apple had a server product out for a long time.
They did.
They kind of ran away from it, and there's still. You can go on eBay right now if you want to do this for fun. Go on eBay, look for an Apple server, and look how much they're selling for even right now. Just because it has, and they're getting to a point where they don't even work with the new Mac version of Mac OS. Right. But look it up and you'll see. the product that's out there in terms of managing your Macs, it just doesn't really exist. Apple's what Apple did is they kind of went this whole other route where they said, well, we're going to create this mobile device management framework for iOS, which is what they did originally.
Correct.
Then they migrated over to Mac OS, and they said, well, we're going to have it in Mac OS too, and that's how we're going to secure our environment. The problem you run into in enterprise America is that from an enterprise perspective, you still have other things you have to do besides just control the device. You need to control what users are able to use that device, what their password frequency is. I mean, one of the things that's in Mac that I think is really cool.
So we should change our password from password 123 to something else?
Well, on a frequent basis. So you have to go like password 123, then maybe password 234, password 456.
And then spell it backwards, right?
Yeah.
Start with the numbers?
Yeah.
Okay.
But one of the things that I think, that completely derailed what I was going to talk about.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. I just thought the password thing was
I lost my whole train of thought right there.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
But one of the things, okay, now I got it. One of the things that I think is really cool about Macs is the ability to have keychain. Mm-hmm. To be able to store all your passwords in a database on the computer itself, encrypted, and it can go ahead and autofill all those passwords for you, and it holds basically all your data.
I do that on my phone.
Right.
Right.
That's really cool on a Mac.
Right.
Here's the problem from an enterprise perspective, and I want everybody to think about this out in IT world right now, in Facebook land. If you have keychain and it's running and it's storing all those passwords, and somebody was able to bypass your system in some way, shape, or form, not get into the encrypted file, but I mean they figured out your master password for everything. They have access to all that. And so when you talk about like an enterprise, from an enterprise security solution, it's different when it's your home stuff.
Sure.
Your home stuff, you control it a little bit more in terms of the way it's used. You have a little more understanding as to what you're logging into and what you're not. But you talk about issuing these out to an entire marketing department, let's say you've got 10, 12, 15 people in your marketing department. And now you're giving them all Macs, and they're using keychain, and they're storing all their corporate passwords in there. And they have one password to log into the machine. That password never really gets changed. That's a big security gap.
Sure, absolutely. Because marketing ties in with all the other departments. I mean, we do it here. I mean, marketing ties in with accounting, with sales, so there's a lot of information in there.
Right, and the reality, I think, the most important part to take away from this conversation, we talk about IT security and firewalls and everything else, which is really important. That's your first layer of defense, the firewall, right? But when you get down to the endpoint side of it, whether it's a PC or it's a Mac, which is why we're talking about Macs right now, you have to have an endpoint security solution. You have to have something like Sophos or Symantec or something that's protecting your endpoint and actually scanning active files as they come in, determining whether or not something is good or bad, and then letting that file access your file system.
No matter what the device.
Yeah, no matter what the device is. Yeah. And we put a lot of focus on the PCs because when you say 9 out of 10 computers out in the world are PCs, which is the reality.
Yeah.
That also promulgates into the business world, but in the business world, we're starting to see more and more Macs just from a creative aspect. When you have more cloud apps and things like that, people's reliance on having a PC to run a software program isn't as great.
No.
So you start seeing things like Slack, and for collaboration tools, and Office 365 cross-platform running on the Mac. So it just makes it a little bit easier for people to bring them in, and it makes it a little bit harder for you as a business owner to be able to protect. But there's solutions out there, and it's really important to make sure that you actually look at those solutions and address them. So.
Absolutely, I agree. So that was a good episode. That was very informative.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. James, you're going to close us out for the day?
Yeah. One thing, just really quick before I close out, when you look at it at the end of the day, if you go online and you search Mac vulnerability on Google, you'll click news, you'll see it. You're going to find 4 vulnerabilities identified in the last 60 days.
Yes, it is.
And that's the reality. So I definitely would say go look into it. Make sure you're securing your infrastructure and your endpoints. If you have Macs in them, make sure you address the Macs too. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you guys next week.
Bye-bye.